Okay, we've only got a couple weeks left after today in this quarter, and we're still in the New Testament. I mean, I had thought beginning that I would spend maybe 5 or 6 weeks covering New Testament characters, followed by 5 or 6 weeks studying Old Testament characters, and here we are, week, 11 or 12, something like that, and we're still in the New Testament, but that's okay. There's a lot in the New Testament that we need to learn about, right? I mean, after all, that's what we're going to be judged by. Doesn't mean that there's not a lot to learn in the Old as well, and I hope to spend at least a couple of classes on the Old Testament, but that'll probably be next week and the following week. So we're going to conclude our study of New Testament characters today in the Profiles of Scripture Supporting Cast. We began last week on the study of the Caesars. I wanted to touch on the Caesars, not so much because of their character. I mean, when it comes to learning from a person's character, with the Caesars, just as with the Herod family, you learn how not to live, right? Because the Caesars, by and large, were a very dysfunctional, to say the least, group of characters. But the reason I wanted to include the Caesars in this study is not because of their character, but because of their place in history. That's what's important. That's what makes the Caesars, the Roman Caesars, the Roman emperors important to us, is because the roles that they played, the context really is the backdrop for the New Testament narrative. And so I presented the 11 first last week. I showed you the bust and all of the first 11 emperors, Roman emperors, and we took a little closer look at about 5 of them because they were reigning during the first 60 years of the first century AD. Now, what 2 monumental events occurred during the first 60 years of the first century AD? Well, that wasn't one of the 2 I was thinking of. There's 2 that happened before that. Okay, establishment of the church, and what before that? Okay, the life of Christ, basically. So you had the life of Christ and the establishment of the church. The destruction of Jerusalem came, 70 AD. That was monumental as well, of course, but not as monumental as those 2 events, the life of Christ and the establishment and growth of the early church. That's what makes the Roman Caesars so important to us, because they were the most powerful men in the world at that time. And so even though they didn't play direct roles themselves, at least knowingly, in those 2 monumental events, the life of Christ and the early church, they were in power at the time, and their lives provide the backdrop for these monumental events. So we mentioned 5 in particular. I gave you just a little brief overview of, I think, the first 11 emperors, which covered most of the first century. But we looked a little closer at 5 of them. Caesar Augustus, the first emperor, of course. We looked at him. We looked at Tiberius Caesar, Caligula a little bit. He's not actually mentioned in the New Testament, but he was reigning like a few years after the church began, and probably about the time that Paul was converted. Caligula would have been the emperor, but he wasn't mentioned in the New Testament narrative. But the 2 others were, and that was Claudius. Actually, Luke called him by that name, Claudius. And then another one, Nero, who he would have been reigning, of course, during the time that Paul was in prison, both times, actually. And so we mentioned them by name. One of the things that I mentioned too was, I think I mentioned, if I didn't, I meant to, but sometimes the New Testament writer might call a man by his title rather than his actual name. For instance, instead of Herod Antipas, Luke might have just said Herod, for instance, And so it was the same case with some of the Caesars. Although Luke would say Caesar Augustus or Tiberius Caesar, he would also sometimes just say Caesar. And so we mentioned that when they when they were trying to trap Jesus, the Pharisees were trying to trap Jesus, and they said, should we pay taxes to Caesar? He said, show me a coin. He was talking about a tribute coin, which had the image of Caesar on it. And he said, whose image is that? And they said, Caesar's. And then, of course, Jesus says, well, render, tribute to Caesar things that are due to Caesar. To God, those things that are due to God. Well, what Caesar was he talking about? Well, the Caesar that was reigning then was Tiberius. So he could have been referring to Tiberius Caesar. And then later, Paul appealed to Caesar. Well, which Caesar did he appeal to? Who? It was Nero. Nero. So you see how these Caesars were in they provide the context for these really important New Testament events. But as I said, it's not their character so much as their place in history that makes them important. And so that's where we get our lessons. And not the character of the Caesars, but the part they played in history. So we're going to look, as class ended last week, we were just starting to go over some of the lessons we can learn from the Caesars. So one of the first is, the most obvious, Christianity is a historical religion, because these dates, I mean, we gave the dates for all these reigns of the Caesars in the first century. It establishes what we could consider anchor posts. These are historical dates. I mean, you can't argue with it. You know, Christianity is not based on some idea, some oral traditions passed down through the ages. It's based on historical facts. We know when Jesus was born, we know where he was born, we know who was reigning during that time in the Roman Empire, and so on. So Christianity is a historical religion. Good evidence for our faith. Good, solid evidence for our faith. Christianity began precisely when God planned. And this is really a fascinating idea. I mean, God planned it this way. He meant for Christianity, he meant for Christ to come and to do his redemptive work, and for the church to establish his church, and for the church to grow in the atmosphere provided by the Roman Empire. And we went back to and looked briefly at Daniel's prophecy. Remember Nebuchadnezzar, some 600 years before Christ ever arrived on the scene, God was giving the Babylonian king a preview of what would happen over the next several centuries. He saw this huge image. It had a head of gold, and it had the chest and arms of silver, the waist and belly of bronze, and then the legs of iron, feet iron mixed with clay. And as he watched this great image, a stone uncut by human hands struck the image on the foot. The image crumbled to pieces, was swept away. Every trace of it was swept away by the wind. And that uncut stone grew into a huge mountain and filled the earth. Well, that was a prophecy of what would happen during the days of that fourth kingdom, which you follow. You just put the Bible aside and just look at secular history. You have the Babylonian Empire, which fell to the Medo-Persian Empire, chest of silver, which fell to the Grecian Empire, bronze, the belly, thighs of bronze, and then the Roman Empire, the fourth empire from the days of Nebuchadnezzar. And in Daniel 2:44, Daniel said, in the days of these kings, the Roman emperors, the Roman Caesars, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. The kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms. It shall stand forever. That's a clear reference, of course, to the establishment of the church during the days of the Roman Empire, the fourth kingdom. And then we looked at Paul's comment in Galatians 4:4, referring to this same period. He said, when the fullness of the time had come, God sent forth his son, born of a woman, born under the law. And then we looked at the phrase, the fullness of time. That's the precise time when God planned to culminate his plan, which he actually began in the Garden of Eden. I mean, if you want to trace it all the way back, you look at Genesis 3:15 right there, right after the first sin was committed, and God was talking to the serpent, and he told him then, he says, one day one is going to be born of the seed of woman who will crush your head. Well, Satan didn't understand the significance of that prophecy, because he played right into God's hands with the crucifixion of Christ. But it began then. God's plan began to be revealed then, and he continued to reveal a little bit more and more of it. Well, finally, when you come to the days of the Roman Empire, the first century AD, then Paul refers to this as the fullness of the time. So what made it the fullness of time? why did God choose this particular time to bring Christ into the world, complete his redemptive plan, establish his church? Why? Well, there were some reasons there. He allowed some things to happen in the 400 years or so between the end of what we call the end of the Old Testament writing. The Old Testament was still in effect, of course, up till the time that Christ was actually crucified. The Old Testament was still in effect, but the writing itself with Malachi was the last Old Testament prophet. He completed his work in the 5th century BC, so over 400 years before Christ. And so what we want to look at is what happened during that 400 years. God was waiting. God was waiting for things to happen. He was watching in the background. It's what we call providence. But he was watching and waiting in the background for these things to happen, which would culminate in the time for him to begin the redemptive work of Christ. And so we can just look briefly again at these. I just want to mention them briefly. During that 400-year period, the Jews were scattered all over the ancient world at the time. They were no longer just concentrated in the land of Palestine, where they had once been. Because of their wickedness, God had brought them first. The Syrians took the northern kingdom away into captivity. They never really returned. The Jews in the southern kingdom of Judah, they were taken to Babylonian captivity, and some of them did return after 70 years. Probably not most of them. I think I've heard some figures up to 50,000 or so, but most of the Jews, even after the Syrian captivity and the Babylonian captivity, were still scattered all over. And then you had the Medo-Persians, and it was actually Cyrus who allowed some of those who wanted to go home could, under the reign of Cyrus of Persia, they could return to their homeland. But again, most of them just lived wherever they were. And then, of course, you had the Grecian Empire, who defeated the Persians and came into power, and followed by the Romans. So you had all of this world conflict going on. Jews were scattered all over the place, but they were still God's chosen people. And they had this promise. They were still waiting on the Messiah. And so you have them now kind of scattered through the ancient world, and as they settled in certain communities, they would build. Most of them no longer had access to the temple in Jerusalem, so they began building synagogues, a place where they could assemble for worship and for study, and such as the church buildings we have today. And so synagogues began popping up all over the ancient world. And so, as we know, when you come to Acts, Paul, if there was a synagogue in a city when he first came to the city, that would be one of the first places he would go, because he knew he would be hearing having an audience there who wanted to learn about God, and so that's where he would begin. So you had synagogues. Then you had the Greek language. The thing about the Greeks is they spread literacy. I mean, Greeks were big on culture, and wherever they went, generally speaking, people became more literate. And so that was probably their major contribution to the world, really, was increasing literacy in the ancient world. A person who could read could probably read Greek. And so Greek language became the English, you might say, of the ancient world. We consider English as a universal language today, and that's pretty much what Greek was, Koine Greek in particular. And I didn't mention this last week, but Jerry Manning reminded me after class. He says, Koine Greek was the most precise written language in the world. Maybe it still is. With its nuances and its vocabulary, it can convey concepts more precisely than perhaps any other language in the world. And that's, of course, the language that God chose to have the New Testament written in, Koine Greek. And so that's a pretty big factor right there as to what came into play during this 400 years. But then, along with the Greek language, you have the Septuagint. Now, what was the Septuagint? We mentioned it last week. Anybody remember what it is? What? Yeah, okay, the Greek Old Testament. About 280 years before Christ, in Alexandria, Egypt, a bunch of scholars got together and translated the Old Testament Hebrew scriptures into Greek. And Septuagint has a lot of problems with it, but the fact is, Jesus and the apostles quoted more from the Septuagint than they did the Old Testament scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures, because that's what people read. The greatest contribution of the Septuagint was it made the Old Testament available to huge numbers of people that formerly could not have read it. And so by the time Christ arrived on the scene, almost 300 years later, then a lot of people knew about the God of the Old Testament. And if they had read it, then they would have understood that there's more to this. There's something else that's going to happen. The Messiah is going to come. And so you see how the Septuagint had a major role in preparing the way for the coming of Christ. But those are all the things that happened before Rome came on the scene. So when the Roman Empire gained power about 100 years, 150 years before Christ arrived, things began to change. And one of the things that changed was peace. We think of the Roman Empire as a warring people, and they were. They conquered a lot of land. But once they became settled in their power, really with Augustus Caesar, the first Roman emperor, at the birth of Christ, Pax Romana became the way of the world, really, at least the ancient Roman world, because Pax Romana means Roman peace. With the Romans, law and order was everything. I mean, that's what they wanted. They wanted control, and they intended to keep control, and the way they kept control was with power and force. And so the Roman law was law. And if you violated Roman law, you would pay the harsh consequences. Everybody understood that. I mean, nations understood it, individuals understood it. And so Roman peace began to prevail. That doesn't mean there weren't wars. I mean, there were a lot of wars of, they were still expanding their empire, and there were revolts and civil wars and so on. But by and large, the world, for about 200 years after the birth of Christ, the world saw more peace than they had probably ever seen, and probably would ever see again, at least in the ancient world. So Pax Romana had a big effect on preparing the way for Christ in the early church. And then Roman protection played another part in this, because if you were a Roman citizen, you had rights that these other subjects, slaves, non-Romans, didn't have. And not only that, they practically did away with piracy on the open seas, which made, of course, made it safer for everybody. So Roman protection had a big part to do with providing the right time. And then you have the Roman roads. Many of them are still in existence today. Roman roads. The thing about the Roman roads is, I didn't mention this last week, but by the time that Paul began his journeys, do you know that the Romans had built 250,000 miles of roads? I mean, that's a lot. That's a long ways. Enough to circle the globe 10 times. That's how many miles of Roman roads they had built throughout all of the lands that they had conquered. How do you think Paul was able to cover so much territory as he did? On Roman roads, the Appian Way and other roads such as that, many of which are still in existence today. Of course, it made land travel safer, easier, faster than it had ever been before in the ancient world. Not only that, the shipping lanes increased. The Romans built 250 major ports that connected all these shipping lanes on the Mediterranean. So obviously these improvements had a lot to do with the spread of the gospel in the fullness of the time, the age of the Roman emperors. But there's one other factor that plays into this, and this is what I mentioned last week. When I decided to present a study on the Caesars, I wasn't really expecting to go here, but this is where my study took me. And as I said last week, I went down the path to the point where I really had gone too far to turn back. So I just proceeded with it. And so the remaining lessons we have here have to do with one other factor that played a part in the fullness of time, and directly with the Roman Caesars and the Roman Empire, and it has to do with Roman persecution. Roman persecution. So, as we think about this, going back to the idea of the fullness of time and how God could have chosen any time, any place he wanted to bring Christ into the world and establish his church. But for some reason, these reasons that we've just mentioned, he chose that period of time 2,000 years ago, but also included in all those things which we would characterize as positive characteristics of that time, such as the spread of the Greek language and literacy and peace, Roman protection, transportation, all those things. Really, we can see how they would aid in the spread of the gospel message, the growth of the church. But what about the Roman persecution? Well, the fact is, it's a fact. I mean, God chose it. He knew it was going to happen. And so I want to look at a few lessons we can learn from the persecution that the first century Christians experienced. Christianity and Roman persecution. We're just going to mention just the 4 brief facts here having to do with persecution in the first century. First, it came from the Jews first. All the persecution accounts that you read about in the New Testament, particularly in the book of Acts, come from the Jews. There may occasionally be Gentiles involved, Roman officials in a particular city, but usually the Romans' involvement would just be to quelch the uproar. They weren't interested in persecuting Christians. They just wanted to keep the Jews basically quiet and at peace. That was the role the Romans played. It was the Jews, of course, who were behind all the persecution, the stoning of, the crucifixion of Christ. And of course, the first Christian martyr, Stephen, he was stoned to death, which, by the way, the Jews, if they had had their way, they would have probably stoned Jesus to death. But the Romans got involved. That was the only way they could get him killed. And so the Romans, their mode of execution was not stoning, it was crucifixion. Of course, that fulfilled a prophecy, which oftentimes, that was one of the fascinating things about the Caesars is, little did they know, the most powerful men in the world at their times, but they were playing into the hands and actually being manipulated by God. They were fulfilling prophecies, of course, made centuries before, not even knowing what they were doing, but they did nonetheless. But when it came to the New Testament narrative, again, we're talking about the first 60 years of the first century A.D., the Jews were behind all the persecution. So all the persecutions we read about in the book of Acts in the New Testament have to do with the Jews. Now later on in some of John's writing, particularly the book of Revelation, I personally believe that he lived and is referring to the persecutions that came as a result of the Roman Emperor Domitian. We'll talk a little bit about that later. But all the persecutions you read about in the book of Acts are from the Jews. When the Roman persecutions did begin, they began probably with Nero. That would have been the time that Paul was and Peter both were executed. And Nero, it's said, it's not, of course, this is not in the Bible, it's not in the New Testament, but tradition, historically, most scholars say that Nero probably set fire to Rome himself to get rid of some of the slums so that he could expand his palace. That's what most scholars say, but at any rate, he used the fire in Rome as a pretext to persecute Christians because he blamed them for the arson, and so there was a severe persecution of Christians. And we read about many of the Christians that were persecuted then in horrible ways, as this picture right here shows, thrown in the arena. This was the first Roman persecution, and it was probably local. Obviously it happened in Rome, but it may have happened in some other provinces. The thing about Roman persecution is it would sometimes only be contained, and it depended on the people who were in authority in a province as to whether or not they persecuted Christians. If they were really loyal to the emperor and wanted to follow suit, then they would persecute Christians in their province. But oftentimes they would just ignore what the emperor was doing back in Rome. But we do know that this would have been the time when the New Testament was closing, at least the narrative, because it ends with Paul in Rome at the end of his first Roman imprisonment, and there was no persecution to speak of there at that time. It would happen later when he went back to his second imprisonment, and that's when he was, tradition says he was executed. This would have been during the time of Nero. So it came in waves. and it was often local as opposed to empire-wide. Now this did change later on, as we mentioned in the reign of Domitian, who reigned from about 10 or 15 years. The last, I think his reign ended in about 96 A.D. But probably John was exiled to the island of Patmos during that time of Domitian's reign. But most of the severe persecutions came 200 or 300 years later, during the 2nd and 3rd centuries. It would not be until the early 4th century when the persecution would finally subside, and this would be with the emperor. Anybody know who the emperor was who basically legalized Christianity? Anybody? Who? Constantine, and he was emperor in the early 300s, the 4th century A.D., and there's the Edict of Milan was the Edict of Toleration, basically legalized Christianity, which put a stop to persecution. But here's the ironic thing. The Edict of Milan and Constantine supposedly being converted, I question whether or not he really was converted, but he was a politician, just like all the other emperors were. And so he had political ambitions, and he had reasons for what he did. And what it did, though, was the Edict of Milan, it gave birth to the Roman Catholic Church. And the ironic thing is, later on, the Roman Catholic Church would pick up persecution themselves, right? I mean, they based themselves on the Roman Empire. And so later on, centuries later, when William Tyndale came along, and he wanted to put the Bible in the hands of the common man. That's what he wanted to do. So he began translating, went back to the Greek. Wycliffe had already translated, I think, the New Testament maybe from the Latin Vulgate, but he wanted to go back to the original Greek and Hebrew and translate it into English and put it into the common man's hands. And what did the Catholic Church do to him? They put him to death as a heretic, right? I mean, isn't it amazing what the Roman Catholic Church did? It's just crazy. But anyway, I think it was probably because of the legalization of Christianity, which ended the persecution but started the Roman Catholic Church, which continued the persecution, and apostasy, we might say. Just furthered the apostasy of the primitive church. I was talking to a Roman Catholic priest one time. He liked to refer to his church as the mother church. The mother church, And so, but actually, his mother church was the Roman Empire, not the primitive church of the New Testament. But that's a whole other subject. I'm starting to chase rabbits now, so forgive me for that. So, why Rome persecuted Christians? And this is interesting. I've kind of made a couple of comments about it already with Constantine and all. I don't believe these Romans, we think of them as idolaters, and they were. They were polytheists. They believed in God, just like the Greeks did. And of course, they, as we mentioned last week, 2 years after Julius Caesar was assassinated, they declared him to be a god, and which was kind of the beginning of what would later be known as the imperial cult worship or emperor worship, which became more and more used during the first century, later half of the first century especially. So, but the basic reason that the Romans persecuted Christians was that they posed a threat to the social order and stability of the empire. Remember what I said earlier about Rome. They were all about keeping law and order and control. Whatever it took. They didn't mind killing anybody if it meant keeping the peace. And so, whenever anybody threatened the order and peacefulness in the empire, they were enemies of the state. That was if you just want to crystallize it down into one statement, this would be it. But there's more to it. So, why were Christians considered enemies? Well, one of the things that made them an enemy of the state was they refused to engage in emperor worship. Emperor worship was not religious, it was political. I mentioned Constantine earlier. Yeah, people say he converted to Christianity. Maybe he did. I don't know. I don't know if he did. I know he didn't convert to New Testament Christianity because it's 300 years later and the church didn't look anything like it had 300 years before. But even if he did, the fact is he was a politician and he was a Roman. And the way Romans thought was, religion in our mind is we hold these deeply held beliefs that basically motivate us to practice our faith in life. That's the way, that's the way Christianity is. It starts in the heart. We know that God is not pleased with anybody who just goes through the motions. And so a mechanical religion is worthless to God. It has to come from the heart. And that's the way Christianity is. Not so with the Romans. Or I might say this, even the Jews, by and large, at least in a lot of them in the Old Testament and even in the New, they were more concerned about what you could see than what you actually felt and believed. And that's the way the Romans were. And so what this meant was emperor worship was used, it was political, and it was used to maintain order. So it would be easy to tell whether or not a person was a friend of the empire or not. If they refused to offer incense to the emperor, automatically an enemy of the state, right? And so, as I was thinking about this, it occurred to me, these Romans were smart people. Didn't they know that these emperors weren't really gods? Well, the Romans in authority, yeah, they knew. Remember Caligula? I mentioned Caligula last week. He was maybe the third Roman emperor. And he was actually murdered, they say assassinated because he was an official, but he was murdered by his own Praetorian Guard because of the outrageous behavior. I mean, it was ridiculous. And I was reading, this was interesting, I was reading one of the Roman historians, Cassius Dio. He quipped this regarding the murder of Emperor Caligula. He learned from experience that he was not a god. Right? Yeah. And think about some of the others. I mean, we mentioned Otho and Nero, emperors in the first century. They committed suicide, as well as many others did. Of course, emperors were assassinated left and right. They were about as far from deity as you can imagine. And so those Romans in authority, they knew that these emperors weren't gods. They knew they weren't, but they were using them as a tool to keep order in the empire. And so it was an effective tool. They could monitor and control the population with emperor worship. Now, I kind of got ahead of myself a while ago, but go back over how Romans viewed religion. As I said, with us, with Christians, it starts in the heart. It's what we believe, and it's going to basically direct how we live. That's the idea behind Christianity. It starts in our heart, and it directs the way we live. Well, in the Roman mind, it's all about action. It's all about what you do. And so it's paying traditional honors paid to the gods through action. And so everything related to religion in the Roman mind was public and deeply tied to politics. So emperor worship brought order and harmony to the empire through events. It was the public display of loyalty to the empire. That's what mattered. And so, for instance, some of these things that the first century Christians would have been subjected to by the Roman Empire, the Roman authorities that they lived under, would be sacrificing to gods at public state-funded temples, attendance at sanctioned festivals, again, religious festivals, donating to civic cults, joining trade guilds associated with Roman gods. And can you imagine you're a Christian trying to provide for your family, but you've got to, in order to make the right connections and to make a living income, you're going to have to be affiliated in some way with these guilds who are idolatrous, organizations. In a similar way, it's kind of like the union, non-union labor strife that we've seen in our generations. To remember if you were if you were a union member and you knew of a non-union member, what was the derogatory name a non-union member would be called by labor? Scabs, yeah, scabs, exactly, right? See, so you're looking down on these people. Well, that's a really mild example of what we would see, and it was extremely more intense during the first century under Roman persecution, because not belonging to a trade guild, again, would be a sign that you're an enemy of the state, or at least dangerous to the state. And so if you refuse to offer incense to the emperor, then you're not a good citizen, and you could be a threat. You could be dangerous to the empire. So you see how this is building up to persecution, how the Romans viewed Christians now. Now, taking all this into account, how they viewed Christians, weird. Have you ever been, people who know you, have you ever thought of you as weird because of your faith? I kind of get that idea at times, depending on who you're around. You're just kind of weird. Well, that's the way the Romans viewed these first century Christians, because they couldn't, in good conscience, participate in all of these activities that were all geared toward the emperor worship, or at least paying homage to these Roman gods. They just couldn't in conscience do it, in good conscience. And so they would withdraw from these social events, which made them antisocial, more suspect in the Roman mind. You see, they were already, when people who wouldn't participate like everybody else would in all of these activities were already under suspect. And then the more things that they did, the more suspect they became. And so they were breaking, of course, with accepted customs, and they were secretive. They had to be secretive because they were, just like in the first century, after the stoning of Stephen, they didn't stay in Jerusalem to be the next in line to be executed. They scattered, but they didn't scatter just go hide, right? They scattered preaching the word, and so churches began popping up in the New Testament world then. But they didn't just remain, but those in Rome and in other provinces, they would stay in secret to worship. They would have to be in secret to worship, and of course that made them even more suspect. And in the Roman mind, superstitious was a problem for the Roman state, because in the Roman mind, they believed people who did things abnormally, or at least not according to the status quo, were automatically probably a little weird, and you would better keep your eye on them because they could be dangerous. And so anything that they did in secret, they must be trying to hide something from us. Anything that is excessive, they seem to be a little bit too obsessed with their faith. That makes them dangerous. They were superstitious. And then, of course, all these rumors that were circulating. You know how rumors are. When people are a member of a minority group, and they don't want to blend in and go along with everybody around them because it's not their faith, it's not their deeply held beliefs. They become, they become suspect, and so rumors begin circulating. And so some of the rumors were that, can you believe these people? They must be cannibals. I mean, they're said to drink the blood and eat the flesh of their Savior. Can you imagine that? Well, that's the communion, right? But you can see how in the Roman mind things would kind of be blown out of proportion. So basically they were considered an illegal cult, and they were destabilizing to the social order of the Roman state. Now, I hate I'm running out of time, but because this is really important. We're getting to the really important lessons. And this is probably one of the greatest lessons we can learn from the Roman Caesars, and that is that the early Christians were not persecuted for their faith in Christ. I mean, the Romans didn't care what you believed. It was all about what you did. As long as you're willing to offer incense to the emperor, then you're okay with us. Just don't stir up any trouble. Well, they didn't care what you believed. It's what you did. So here's the lesson. Early Christians were not persecuted for their faith in Christ. They were persecuted for their exclusive faith in Christ. They refused to compromise. Now that's the key right there, and that's why we see so much persecution in the first century, because they weren't going to even go through the motions of giving the impression that they believed that the emperor was a god and they were going to worship him. That wasn't an option for them. They believed that if they did so, it would be the same as denying Christ. And that's why so many of them died for their faith. It wasn't because of their faith in Christ, it was because of their exclusive faith in Christ. They weren't going to compromise. They refused to compromise. Well, we must strive for the same steadfast faith. So there's one other lesson, and I'm only going to be able to mention it, and then we'll conclude next week, and then maybe begin with the Old Testament. But this is really important as well. As I mentioned earlier, God could have chosen any other time to bring Christ into the world and begin His church. He could have. He could have waited until, I guess, I don't know. We've never had a century in the history of the world where there was complete peace and everything. This was probably the best time. Obviously it was. It's when God chose. But here's the lesson that's kind of hard to swallow, but it's the truth. It's this right here. Suffering persecution has its place in God's plan. Now, I want you to think about that, and we're going to look at it a little closer next week. Suffering persecution has its place in God's plan. He planned it all along. Well, I certainly appreciate your good attention.